Okay, so if we're going to knock out fossil fuels, what we're going to replace them with is a whole lot of technologies that require metal, and it has to come from mining. So I looked at the whole value chain. The first sore spot is going to be the current industrial capacity of China to manufacture stuff is too small, right? Even as large as it is. But okay, we can resolve that by building more stuff. What we can't do is magic up more minerals.
In June 2023, I hosted 6 interviews, which became known as the Net Zero Delusion series. At the time, the videos were for subscribers' eyes only. The basic idea was simple. The writing was already on the wall for net zero. The real question was how it would fail and how investors could position themselves to profit from this. These days, net zero is falling apart before our very eyes. Not a day goes by without news of all the different ways that it's failing. That means the investment ideas we presented in our series back in 2023 have now begun to play out. So, did our experts get their predictions right 2 years ago? We invite you to watch the Net Zero Delusion series for yourself to find out. Hello and welcome to the interview in our series on net zero that I was most excited to do. That's because this interview is with the man who undermined net zero, literally. Simon Michaux is an associate professor at the Geological Survey of Finland's Circular Economy Solutions Unit. He has a PhD in mining engineering and spent the first half of his career in the Australian mining industry, specialising in the blasting and crushing of rock. His 2021 report, Assessment of the Extra Capacity Required of Alternative Energy Electrical Power Systems to Completely Replace Fossil Fuels, completely upended the net zero debate by pointing out a rather hard constraint that others had failed to take into account in their projections on how to reach net zero. They forgot to consider whether there are enough resources like copper, lithium, and cobalt to make net zero possible in the first place. Simon has since presented his findings to the UN a few times and several governments. I'm surprised they invited him back. What makes Simon so interesting is that he is a complete believer in the alarmism of climate change and that something must be done about it. Nevertheless, he came to the inescapable conclusion that our current energy transition is simply not viable. His conclusion for what happens next will shock you. I'm joined today by Simon Michaux, the social media climate change sensation. Thanks very much for joining us, Simon. I want to start this interview by thanking you for not blowing me up when you used to blow up rocks in Brisbane, and I'll let you explain why.
G'day, Nick. How you doing? So, way back when I was doing my PhD in Australia at the JKMRC, and my PhD was blasting rocks. And I had small-scale blasting of rocks where we would blow them up and then we would size the fragments and put them into a blasting model. And that was my PhD.
It's a good start. Did anybody die? Was there any injuries?
There were no injuries. We did have, when you do a blasting, you must have a little bit of explosive left over to do what's called a sympathetic blast. As in, if the last test does go, the detonator does not go off, you need to have a second charge put in to actually blow up the first one. And so at the end of the day, you've got a little bit of explosive, but you're not allowed to store the explosive either. So at the end of the day, we used to blow it up. And so what we would do is we would take it's in the open pit there, and we would actually you would bury the charge to detonate it, and you'd have like a pile of old tires on top. And the top tire would always be thrown, by the force of the blast, right? And so we had this box of old toys, and then one was like I think it was like kids' toys that had been left out in the sun, and they're all faded and falling apart, and so we would actually balance a toy on top of the actual tires and see how far we could throw the toy. So, yeah, no one died, but lots of toys might have been damaged.
I just had a vision of all these tires rolling off in every different direction. But let's move on to the key ideas in this report that you've written that's gone so viral. And, you've done countless videos since, interview videos, I know because I've been watching them. And they've all had this extraordinary impact because it's such a simple idea. I think you call it mineral blindness. That's what you're really implying that governments and institutions around the world have. So tell us, what's mineral blindness? And what's the key claim in your report?
So there's actually a series of reports. The first of them was a report on the oil industry. So what happened was when I came to Europe, there was just a series of blind spots. There was information missing, and what I was asked to look at was this in 2018. At the time, gigafactories in Europe were a thing. That's what everyone was focusing on. What kind of minerals and how much quantity of minerals will those gigafactories of Europe need to function? Like, what minerals will we need, where we get them from, etc. And it hadn't really been looked at. And I found very quickly that there were massive gaps in the information. So yes, there's a series of blind spots. And the first blind spot was what I call the China firewall. Everything's coming from China through the market. The Europeans are not extracting raw materials themselves. They're buying it off the market. And as such, they don't understand the practicalities of the commodities industry, and they think the whole thing's an economic issue. That's blind spot number one. Blind spot number two was they had no energy blind. They had no concept of what energy did for them, and they had no concept of what fossil fuels in particular was doing for them, and largely still don't. And the third blind spot, which is where I did my thing, was minerals blind, which is society at large is consuming large volumes of minerals on a day-to-day basis through the value chain. But also, if we're going to phase out fossil fuels, and how we plan to do it will be dependent on a vast quantity of minerals, vast quantities of relatively exotic minerals. And so what I found was that the numbers were missing. So I actually sort of mapped out the numbers that were needed to replace the system around you now. If that was all completely non-fossil fuel stuff off the available in the market, how much metal would we need? And then put that up against reserves and existing mining production resources. So that was the basic premise. But what it very quickly showed was the mechanics, the actual practicalities hadn't really been thought through. Even at a fairly superficial level, there was no understanding, for example, of the size of the global transport fleet. There are a few individual nations, but no one has stitched it together. And so, yeah, and so what I'm sort of showing here is the idea that we love our tribes. You're either for climate change or you're against climate change, or whatever. But all such tribes, I think, will dissolve. There's a whole new set of issues are now sort of coming up, which are showing that in architecture of the different tribes doesn't really work anymore. On one hand, fossil fuels are deteriorating, right? Whether you're part of the climate change camp or whether you're part of the peak oil could be November 2018. And so gasoline supply is now being supplanted by the gas industry. And so we're becoming very gas dependent now. But that's a deep inefficiency which is going to cause problems later. So fossil fuels, one way or another, is now starting to phase out. But our after fossil fuels plan still has not been developed. There are practicalities in there that we're missing. And so now what, guys? And so this is the purpose of the work, was to actually get the people who control our society. And what I'm talking about is the people who control the hedge funds, the banking sector. Right? What do they think are going to happen? Right? And what are their plans for the future? And my work was to talk to them and show them that their plans are not going to work and a new plan needs to be made. Because there are plans around, but they're stopped. They're prevented from actually going anywhere.
Yeah, it's very easy to interpret your work as being sort of anti the attempt to reach net zero. But what it's really doing is pointing out the current plan is not entirely plausible, or we're not actually on route to where we say we're going. So I call it metallic dissonance, like cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, that's actually a nice term.
Yeah, it's a different way of putting mineral blindness.
If I use that, I'll quote you, mate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Don't tell them that I exist at the UN. So you summarized this report by saying it puts a nail in the coffin of certainly a 100% renewable strategy, but probably a renewables dominant strategy. And you focus that analysis on mining specifically. So what was it about mining and resources and metals that makes that the most important constraint?
So what's happened is we've fundamentally misunderstood the commodities industry. At the moment, for example, oil, gas, coal, and uranium are commodities that lead to our energy. And we have treated them like infinite resources. We'll always find more, right? And what is not understood is our ability to extract those resources is the limitation, not the resources themselves. Like there's lithium in seawater. Great. Can we access it though in a viable way? Probably not. Right. So, yeah. And so, mining, okay. So if we're going to knock out fossil fuels, what we're going to replace them with is a whole lot of technologies that require metal, and it has to come from mining. So I looked at the whole value chain. The first sore spot is going to be the current industrial capacity of China to manufacture stuff is too small, right? Even as large as it is. But okay, we can resolve that by building more stuff. What we can't do is magic up more minerals. Now, the mining industry is actually where I came from in Australia. So it's a scenario I was comfortable with. And I was to show that our ability to produce the needed number of metals as we are at the moment is well and truly not good enough if we were to go down this path. And so then I was to look at the basic question of, well, if the mining industry was to aggressively expand, how much by? Are we talking about like an extra 10 mines a year or what? So the answer is a couple of 1,000%. And that is the way the mining industry is actually has to operate. That's not practical. It's just not feasible. Certainly not in the time we've got. Now, time was the problem. I sat in a European Commission meeting in 2017, and they were talking about being 100% green transition compliant by 2030. So everything's electrified by 2030. And I remember thinking at the time was that statement is so untethered from reality, it's terrible. But it was taken as law. Yes, and everyone's nodding along, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And we go, wow. So the mining industry is actually, if we're going to if minerals are the new oil, how are we going to manage that when then we're moving into an era of scarcity and where the ability to manufacture and process those minerals is concentrated geographically on one part of the planet, and everyone else is dependent on that bottleneck. And that spells a situation that's very difficult to manage. So what I was trying to do is to lay down the boundary conditions of what is rolling in, the hard numbers of, because the apparent solution to a lot of this will be we can't magic up more commodities, and we can't really change our industrial profile very quickly, but society itself can flexibly respond. And it can respond in an emergency context. It'll probably be like a shortage, like things will just be unavailable on the market, and they'll just have to make do. But it's not a temporary thing. We're talking about a permanent shift and a permanent contraction. And to try and describe that as coming is a very challenging message, but you need a data foundation to say that. And that, I suppose, is one of the purposes of the work.
Yeah, it's like you pointed out, the emperor has no clothes in a very scientific way. And I'd be fascinated to know what happens when you do present and when you do speak up in those types of meetings that you mentioned.
They're all very polite. They're all very supportive. In the year, I've now presented this work 160 times, 160 something times. 91 of those times is in the year 2022, and it was to some fairly high profile people all over the world. And so what I found was there was a pattern. 100% of the time, first they were shocked. They were completely unprepared. And they're completely unprepared, and they didn't know how to respond. So the second thing was they couldn't refute what I was saying because the data sources I was using were blue chip. And I had the assumptions up. It is based on assumptions. But the third thing, they actually came back and they said, all right, mate, you scared the hell out of us. Now you're going to fix it. Tell us what to do. And so I was asked to look at reinventing the circular economy in context of this work. And the first work for that has now gone out in a policy briefing to governments. So in person, people were very supportive. They're not ignoring it. I've been invited back quite a few times now. Like I said, there's civil servants who advise members of parliament have become very interested in this work. The engineering sector, the mining sector, the academic sector, especially in Finland and in Sweden, corporations, mining corporations, but also corporations that run power plants, they've all been very, very proactive. Fortum, in particular, in Finland, was very sort of proactive in understanding. Let's show us your numbers, show us what you mean, and they wanted to actually sort of go over that with a blowtorch and a spotlight, and no one has worked out a response yet. They're still getting their arms around it and they're still processing it. But what I'm finding in person, people are taking this in terms of serious intellectual debate. We've been given some ideas and we'll now have a debate back and forth. Like, can we pressure test this? Can we audit this? Can we look at this? And so that is what I hoped would happen. On Twitter, the trolls like throwing poo. But when they do, it tends to be very personal, and it doesn't act, and they'll take the numbers out of context. So this work is about to be published in a peer-reviewed journal in full, all calculations, both studies, and it's out, it's done, and I can then hopefully move on to something else. So,
I doubt it. I think you're going to be stuck with this for quite a long time. It sounds like it's going to be a big part of your life. Which particular metals are you focusing on here? Is there any particular ones that are, the key constraints or the key bottlenecks?
Yeah. So the way I approached this was work out what's needed, right? And so what are the metals in a given, what are the metals in solar panels? What are the metals in wind turbines? What are the different units brought to market? What are the metals in different chemistries for batteries? How much are those going to be in the market? How many were there? And so you end up with a list of tasks and metals, and they're all compressed into one column. How much metal will we need for copper? How much metal will we need for... And so we started that way, and then what fell out the other end was in terms of... I've got the numbers up on my screen here. In terms of production, and the mining production at the moment, metals that are going to be a problem are copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, graphite, vanadium, germanium, and all the rare earth elements, neodymium, lanthanum, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, all have serious shortfalls in a production context. So we need to expand. And so, all right, let's say we were able to expand to the max, to what reserves we have at the moment. And now we've got, I've picked out ones to focus on. Copper is what I'm most worried about. You can make batteries out of something else, but good luck replacing copper. You can use aluminium in some applications, but not all. So after this nickel, like now Elon Musk recently came out. I admire Musk and his team. He's done some remarkable stuff. So he worked out a way of making batteries without lithium using a variant of NMC 532, which is amazing. But that NMC 532 chemistry will need nickel, and it will need cobalt, and will need manganese. So we've got copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and vanadium. You could argue that we're just going to make batteries out of something else like zinc or fluoride or sodium, which we can, but we've got to develop the value chain for. The two metals that we can't replace easily are copper and nickel. And there's some hard stops on that. So they're reserves. Now, as a reserve is a resource is a mineralized patch of ground that is more mineralized than background mineralogy would suggest. There are no assessments of whether it's actually possible to extract. It could be too deep. It could be, the grain size could be just too fine. And the grade could be just too low. And all that. So a reserve is something that's economically viable to extract at the point. So let's say if we were to go to resources, and then people often say, well, let's just mine the seafloor, which in our current state of technology is a really dumb idea. That would cause problems if we were to go that route. But if you put reserves, resources, and the resources under the sea all together, we've got now something like 3.2 billion tons of copper in the system we call planet Earth, but we need 4.7 billion tons. Right, and that's to make the first generation of stuff, which wears out. Like cars wear out after 10 years or 15 years, or let's say 20 years on average. Cars, batteries, current technology, the way it is at the moment, all that stuff will wear out after 20 years, and you'd have to do it again. So where do we find that amount of metal from, even if we were to mine the seafloor? And so what this is basically showing is this whole direction's not going to work. That's the outcome. So instead of actually sort of trying to flog ourselves finding more resources, right, and instead of saying we're doomed, it's not going to work, find a new direction. Find a new plan. And that new direction, new plan will probably be society will reorganize itself to the point where it doesn't need so many resources. And yeah, that won't be pleasant. We're very used to having all our toys, but this is the reality of what's coming.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that because I find it genuinely terrifying, especially the level of political control. You call, I think, the social contract has to be rewritten. But let's focus a bit more on some of the supposed solutions to this challenge, which you've done a good job of pointing out have their own flaws. I don't know which ones in particular you want to focus on, but there's the idea of recycling in the circular economy, which you're a real expert on. We've got the battery idea, which solves obviously intermittency of the resources, but then of the renewables, but then poses its own resources challenges. You've got all sorts of other topics that are proposed as solutions to the challenge that you've identified. Give us a few of those and your response to them.
So every single, solution we've got on the books at the moment has a bottleneck, a practical bottleneck in some form. For a start, can we actually make the first generation of technology units in the numbers that we have at the moment? And the answer is no. So we could do things like, well, instead of actually having lots of individual cars, could we have communal transport like buses and trains and trams? Okay. And so we have our infrastructure compressing around that, and cars will still be around, there'll be less of them. Can we have a mix of, say, hydrogen fuel cells and electric vehicles? Sure, but hydrogen has its own challenging problems. It's not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. You've got to make the hydrogen, and if you're not allowed to use gas or coal, you've got to you've got to use electrolysis to do it. You need much more electricity to make the hydrogen than to charge the batteries, the equivalent batteries of the equivalent EV system. So here is how things go sideways. And so we need more electricity on a large system. Now you need many, many more power stations. And so it's like a network, a system where if you make a change in one area, it changes everything around that system. So wind and solar are highly intermittent, and we need a power buffer for that. At the moment, all systems are buffered externally from an external, like each supply and demand must actually balance perfectly, like to a millionth of a second. And at the moment, what we do is when we need more power, we just buy more power from one of the networks around us, and that's how they operate. But if that's using fossil fuels, and fossil fuels can be turned on or off at will. Gas in particular. So if we don't use fossil fuels anymore, and if most of the system is wind and solar, we're highly dependent on the weather, and the systems are so large that they can't be balanced off each other. They've got to be internally self-sufficient. And the practical engineering limitations of that, we just haven't really sort of thought through. Like, what's the seasonal difference between summer and winter in terms of performance of solar panels? That is something that has not been needed to look at, because whatever production those solar panels were doing, any shortfall could come from another network. And so that there's that problem. I looked at the nuclear industry. And so when I looked at the nuclear industry, I looked at the thinking for the nuclear industry as it is now. And In fact, one of the motivations for doing the work was I actually heard a senior civil servant say that all future nuclear power plants should be generation 2 because they're cheaper to build and we've got more experience with them, so we know what we're doing. And that blew me away, because yes, Gen 3 Plus is more expensive and more complicated, but anyone who has an understanding of the nuclear power plant system, the safety issues, the safety systems in place to stop something like Chernobyl from happening. Like Chernobyl wouldn't have happened if it was Gen 3 Plus, and so on, and so, all right, but can the nuclear power plant industry help us? And so, well, if we were to bring on 25 new reactors a year, every year from the year 2025 onwards, and if they only took 5 years to build instead of what they do now, and if society at large got behind the nuclear industry and built all the infrastructure out needed to support it, the enrichment plants, the handling facilities, the spent nuclear fuel storage of waste and all that, okay, what would that look like? And so how much power could it bring to the system? And at the moment, nuclear is about 10%, and we want to get to the point where it overtakes all other systems as the primary energy source for fossil fuels. And so after working out how much power we would need, how much of that can come from nuclear, and so if we expanded out at that rate, all existing reserves would be chewed up in about 75 years, get out to 2100. And you get about 60% of the way there. Right, and yes, we can go find more uranium. We're not running out of uranium, but the problem is, can the nuclear power plant expand fast enough to be useful? And the answer is no. And that's why nuclear hasn't really sort of taken over, because it's really, really logistically difficult to handle in its current form. However, and one by one, the other one was biofuels to mass. And it says, so it worked out if all gasoline became biofuels, how much biomass will we need? And the planet cannot physically deliver that much biomass, right? Not even close, right? So that direction has its problems as well. So the solution is going to be a combination of everything put together like a jigsaw puzzle. So not only are we going to have to contract, but where we get our energy from is going to be from like a variety of sources. So what has to happen here, instead of actually accepting what we've got now, we need a breakthrough. One of the systems we're looking at needs a breakthrough, so it needs to evolve. For example, if we could make batteries that don't wear out, and if we could make batteries out of a commonly held mineral, so I saw a paper where they're making batteries out of table salt. Right? Okay. All right. That's different. So that's the storage of the power. Now we're going to generate the power. All power generated has to recognize the fact it's got to come from somewhere. Right? The power itself has to come from somewhere, from some natural source. And we need the technology to be able to harvest that, and the technology itself can't wear out too quickly. And how do we replace that technology? So there's a number of things I was looking at in an unconventional sense that might actually change things. For example, if someone was to actually work out if we could drill holes very deeply, quickly and easily, then geothermal could become a more prominent energy source. Have we done it yet? No. In the environment we're trying to do this, our financial systems are under serious strain now and are not in a situation for industrial reform. Right, so that's something that we need to be cognizant of. And also, our industrial capability to do things has become atrophied in most continents because it's all happening somewhere else. And where it's happening somewhere else, we are trying to start a military engagement with, which is, somewhere between not very bright and flamboyantly stupid, right? How do we allow this situation to develop? Right. So one of the things I've become interested in is an evolution of the nuclear fuel cycle, where there's a nuclear fuel called thorium. And thorium in its current form has its practical limitations. So the the thorium fuel, when you actually produce electricity from it, is not as efficient as uranium, but you don't have the fuel wastage that you do in uranium, and what is produced at the end is not as nasty as conventional nuclear fuel. And so that the back end of the fuel cycle is actually much more civilized. But the practicalities at the front end of the thorium fuel cycle have its practical limitations. And the nuclear industry at the moment would really sort of prefer to stay with uranium for that reason. So there is an evolution of a side part of the thorium fuel cycle called thorium molten salt. And I'm still going down the rabbit hole on this one to actually sort of see if I can look at. But the nuclear fuel cycle, thorium molten salt, seems to be quite different to all the others. And then we've got the problem of how do we extract thorium in and make thorium fuel in a quick and easy fashion, whereas at the moment there's quite a complicated hydromet solution to go after, which most nation states aren't interested in doing that. And so, can we get that thorium in an unconventional way that doesn't have those problems? So all of those things exist, and I'm looking at it. But let's say we got it up and running, and we proved it to work, and then we've got to industrialize and make it to an industrial scale, and then manufacture it many times and get it out to everyone. That's 10, 20 years, right? We need a solution on the ground and operating and delivering power in the next year or two. So it's not going to arrive in time. And so there are solutions we can go towards that might actually sort of help things along, but we're in for a serious rough patch because we've waited this long to actually look at the problem. That's the message.
It strikes me that a lot of these challenges are cumulative. So the more you try and solve one of the problems, the more the others get worse, largely because they rely on the same resources to solve.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's this weird situation where if we make progress in one area, we build lots of wind turbines, then we're lacking resources to build the grid we need or whatever it might be. So what's going to happen there? I mean, is there going to be a priority on which ones we try and do, or will they all just fail?
I think we're going to see a big old mess. And the problem is human perception of both the problem and the refusal to see it, and human perception to actually innovate a solution is the solution. So we're both the problem and the solution. We're in the way, but if we got out of the way, all of a sudden things could flow. So what we're going to see, I believe, is we're going to try everything. And we're going to see there'll be an example of every solution and every problem and every dumbass decision will be out there for everyone to see. And things will sort of move forward, and it'll be interesting to see which one survives. There'll be a lot of vested interests in certain solutions because a lot of money is invested in them.
Historically speaking, though, that's not how governments operate, right? They decide that it's going to be wind and solar, and that's it, or they decide we're going nuclear. So, I mean, that doesn't. I don't see how you can expect sort of a million flowers to bloom versus the government's going to decide what we're doing.
So that's how we do it at the moment. The government will decide, and we go off, and that is true. So what if that government solution doesn't work, followed by that government now has many other problems to deal with at the same time? We're talking 7 or 8 macro scale problems reaching a pain threshold in the same 10 to 20 year window. Right? All of those problems are visible now, but when they reach a pain threshold, they'll be forced to do something about them. While you're trying to, rebuild the energy system, they're going to be dealing with hyperinflation. And we've also got the problem is a lot of our government structures at the moment simply aren't trusted, and some of their conduct has been what you might call criminal.
Yeah, let's not go there. As rich as that pain may be.
Yeah. No, I understand, right? But what that means is they're going to be distracted. They're going to be distracted, and they're not going to be able to do it. Meanwhile, the population on the ground will have to actually say, "We need to do stuff." They go, "Oh, okay, really? Oh, okay," and off we go. And so some solutions will be done on a small scale. One thing I saw was very interesting. right? And this is something that, you could make in your garage, right? Let's say you've got a pond or a water source, and you could actually have like a conveyor belt with a series of containers that fill up full of air, compressed air underwater. The water rises. When it gets to the top, it opens up, and then it collapses, and then it's pulled down on a chain. As you're using the buoyancy of water to turn something. You could be doing that, and you could be turning a generator. Something as simple as that might actually generate electricity, right? And so what I was just saying is our conventional ways of thinking towards something, all bets are off. All our assumptions of in the past, where we have signed over our thinking for all sorts of things to a small number of people and trusted them to do it. And when the wheels fall off, everyone steps up all at the same time, and they start looking at everything, and they will problem solve. And it's going to be messy as hell, and a lot of it's going to be impractical, but some of it might work. And that's what I'm saying is we're going to see millions of flowers bloom in and around all the really big ones that we really hope will work.
Yeah, that sounds very nice. Let's quickly draw on your experience of the mining industry as well, because one of your key messages is that not only are we expecting mining to expand at this impossible rate, mining as an industry is actually already struggling inherently anyway.
Yes.
Not just because of its energy intensity, which is going to get constrained, but also just the nature of mining.
Yes. So 20 years ago, in fact, you might have seen the first generation of this. It was originally called 6 Caveats That Will Change Our Design Culture. So I came up with a series of ideas that the mining industry was actually having a series of technical problems there's been several eras of mining. Back in the day, a couple of guys could get together and they could go panning down in the creek, and you could get like nuggets of whatever metal, and that's all you needed to do. And you literally could get started with a couple of shovels and a pan. That was it, and you could make money. But then it got to the point where you actually started to have to actually build mines with infrastructure. So you needed the backing of rich investors, and say 2 or 3 people would back the mine and they would make money. Then you had the idea of a large corporation making these massive mines where it took, a lot of money and many years of hardcore engineering to actually sort of get things going, what we can make money in. Now, then we got the era of governments were required to actually make infrastructure, build power stations, roads and ports. And so governments became like a proxy partner. And now when a mining corporation starts a mine, the shareholders put up 30% of the capex, and the rest comes from a hedge fund or a bank. And so the banking sector now controls the mining sector. And so that's the era we're in. The era we're growing into is costs are rising for a variety of technical reasons, right? And it's getting, mining was the biggest, was the medium risk, high return game in town, right? Now it's actually quite a high risk, and the returns are still all right some of the time, but now there's many examples where you could fail and you could lose money. And so what's happening there is they're having to put a lot of money in on these really big low-grade deposits. And it's taking a long time to pay off the capex debt, and it's taking a long time to actually get the money back. So investor appetite to go into mining is getting harder and harder to get hold of. The projects are getting larger and larger, and the costs are going up and the returns are going down. What's happening is grade is decreasing. We've mined out all the nice deposits, and now we've got the hard-to-work low-grade deposits in challenging postcodes. So the rock hardness is increasing because we're now going to fine grinding a lot, so the grind size is smaller, needing more energy. But that usually means in disseminated mineralogies, the rock tends to be quite a bit harder. And when we're going finer grinding, we tend to need more water, potable water, because it's harder to recycle when the grind size is so fine. And so we're consuming more energy, more potable water. And these operations are now really, really large in scale compared to what they were, say, 50, 60 years ago. And they're often in places with water shortages, and in some cases energy shortages. And so, so the mining industry was struggling to maintain its existing growth. And in fact, what we're now seeing in the copper industry now is they've actually peaked production and they're in a decline. We're not running out of copper deposits. We're running out of getting people to invest in capital to get mines going. Like if you've got to make, say, spend $4 billion on a mine before you actually sort of start making any money at all, but you might get that money back in 10 to 12 years, and also you might not. Or you can put it in the stock market and get it back in 6 weeks. You know, it's someone's actually got to go out and do the work. And in the past, we've always assumed it would be so. But it's getting harder and harder to do so, and the rewards to do so are getting less and less. And so that the mining industry is struggling to maintain its existing profile. Also, we've got issues with supply tends to be quite centralized. Demand. In 2012, China was the principal customer for the Australian mining industry, and for strategic reasons, they turned the tap off. They said, "Okay, we don't need your resources anymore." And overnight, the Australian mining industry crashed, and I was one of the people laid off from my position in that. And so that, like 100 years ago, industry was fairly well evenly spread across the 6 continents. Everyone mined, everyone had a smelter, everyone did manufacture. And that's not the case anymore. And so that's showing problems. So that's the way we are now. The idea that mining industry, with all its problems, and there's a whole host of problems of trying to sort of hold things together. The idea that we can expand by several thousand% is ridiculous. Even if the money arrived and price went up and suddenly it all became very valuable, they physically cannot expand fast enough or even anywhere near the capacities required. And that's a hard reality.
Let's move on to a part of the analysis that I think you can uniquely provide, which is that you were in the room for the European Commission's, as it was devising or creating its net zero ambitions. My question to you...
They were reporting on it.
How can governments miss something so obvious? How can they get it so wrong? How can they just assume away the challenge of actually providing the resources that are needed to build all this stuff?
So that's actually a question that I've been thinking on for a while now, and it's a very pertinent question. And the question comes down to this: is this stupidity or did they mean it? So I've come to the conclusion that ideology has been the source of all our problem solving for the last 50 years. Since the early 1970s, if we choose to ignore reality, then reality was ignored. For example, when everything became a fiat currency, if you wanted to balance your budget, you simply printed more cash and life was good. Right. And so that, and then that mentality, that economic mentality, became the heart of all other operations. And so everything is now an economic action and is driven by price. But if we are not forced to maintain, to meet biophysical reality, then if we can magic our way around something, we will. Right. So for the last 10, 15 years, we've been, for the last 100 years, society has been using fossil fuels to the point where we no longer even see them. Right? So energy, it just happens in the background. It is so cheap and so easy. We waste it. Like, street lights on. On all of our electrical equipment, there is lights on it to make it look like it's based on appearance and whim and entertainment, right? Like energy is so cheap and abundant that we don't even see it anymore. And so the whole system has been using fossil fuels like we're dependent upon it, like the oxygen we breathe. Now, since 2008, they've been talking about the circular economy and green transition in some form. While they've been talking about that, the system's been using fossil fuels, and every year we've used more fossil fuels. And so all of the gains that we've actually had of things like solar panels coming online and wind turbines, and we've worked mightily to get that done. And what's been achieved so far sits on top of everything else. It hasn't phased out any fossil fuels. The system has expanded so much that any gains in renewables were overrun. Right. So while we're talking about phasing out fossil fuels, we continue to use fossil fuels. And so at an ideological point of view, we talk in terms of platitudes in a way we've never had to actually do or deliver what we say. And so it's a combination of ideology and the fact that we just haven't started. And so all of these governments who talk to each other, never once did they actually approach an engineering group and say, we want you to develop a feasibility study for the phasing out of fossil fuels and show us the numbers. And the reason they didn't do that, I think it just didn't occur to people. It just wasn't part of the thinking, because the thinking was market-driven. And the market assumption that all resources are infinite, necessity is the mother of invention. If we need it, someone will develop something. Right, and so the thinking at our ideologically level did not actually allow for that. The other problem, I think, is the implications of this are so challenging that they don't want to know. Now, there have been multiple countries that have done studies in peak oil, and multiple countries, and they've actually kept those outcomes confidential. In the report that I wrote for the oil industry outlook, I listed them. And so the countries that actually had, like there was Germany, there was the United States, there was Great Britain, they all understood the concept of peak oil. And they then made the report outcomes confidential. What they did do is go to war in areas where there happened to be oil. Right? So it's not so saying is, just because they don't tell the public doesn't mean they don't understand, but they're terrified of actually having a frank discussion with the public. So there's that mentality. And, keep talking in platitudes, it's fine. It's fine. If we start talking reality, someone's going to lose their job. And so, and then there is the idea that everyone understands that there is a problem coming, and they don't want to talk about it because to be a politician, you've got to be democratically elected. And to be democratically elected, you've got to be elected on something that's popular. And suggesting any of this stuff is deeply unpopular. So they don't want to know about it, but they know it's coming. So when they do hit that difficult window, they can make the hard decisions and show strong leadership. And the previous administration didn't do their job. We'll make the best of it. And really, guys? Yeah, I think it's a combination of something in that.
You mentioned that it's a market-driven thinking. I take your point once you described it. But to me, it's the opposite. It's the government saying carbon emissions must be capped at this level. That's what matters most. We have to do this to save the planet. How we get there and figure out how we get there is the secondary consideration. So they've announced the destination before figuring out how to get there because the destination is so important to them.
The belief across the board, and everyone involved, they believe this is someone else's problem. You can say all these really strong statements till the cows come home, but if you don't think it's actually your problem to go and do it, you know the idea of the armchair critic or the armchair general. It says everyone believes, the politicians, all the pundits, even a lot of the activists in the various different tribes, what they're shouting to do. Everyone believes it's actually not their problem. Because when you actually get down to practical reality, if you were to tether your actions to what needs to happen in a practical context, things become so much more difficult. And if you understood that, you would shape your language accordingly, and you'd be, instead of being combative, in the different tribes, we like to indoctrinate each other and shout at each other and destroy the opposing point of view, when really we should be more collaborative. We've got a big problem here, guys. What are we going to do about it? And can you help me? And we don't see any of that.
Yeah, you're talking about the engineering problem, and the mining problem, and the manufacturing problem. You're not talking about the scientific side of climate change. It's the solution.
But even that. So we take the scientific side of things, and so and even that sits in tribes, right? But then when we get to the point where what do we do about it? The one thing that can change is the social side of things, society. How is society structured? How does society see things? And the engineering stuff is the support function, but it's also the physical boundary conditions. And so what has to happen is multiple sectors need to come together and work together instead of assuming someone else will fix it.
So let's say we do try and reach net zero to the best of our abilities by, I guess, in the way envisioned currently, even though we both believe that that's not plausible. But let's say we do our best effort. What would it take? What does society look like if we actually pursued that level of mining, manufacturing, and so on and so forth?
So this is also a point to make as well. I believe carbon emissions are a side issue to the real problem. And the real problem is species die-off, land degradation, ocean acidification, right, and the deterioration of life systems on the planet, right? And that, from a geological point of view, the planet has gone through many, many changes in the past. Climate change like you wouldn't believe, right? But the stability of the planet was maintained by life on the planet. So life on the planet has to be maintained first, and then human systems can function second. So the entire bottom of the food chain is crashing. Insects, small birds, plankton in the sea, arable land is declining, which means the bacteria load in the soil is being wiped out. The entire bottom of the food chain, and over time that'll have a ripple effect, which will wipe out the top of the food chain. The large vertebrate mammals like us, and that is a problem. And so focusing on, if we stopped all carbon production tomorrow, but we continued on multiple other fronts, for example, how we produce our food, and how we manage our industrial waste plume, we'd be not only in as much trouble, but worse trouble. Right, so what would it look like? Because the whole system the after fossil fuel system hasn't been built yet. That's just a reality, right? And it takes energy to do so. So we will have to use fossil fuels to build the next system, whatever that is. So we've got to actually sort of have an adult conversation about what fossil fuels are and what we should use them for, and stop. There's a lot of guilt and anger and judgment and shame and how we use fossil fuels at the moment, but it's all about making money and maintaining the existing system. We've got to recognize that we've got to build a new system. We've got to substantially simplify our system, and it has to be substantially less complex. And that's just an energy reality. The energy that goes into an organism defines its size and complexity. Less energy, it has to be smaller, or it has to be simpler.
So you're talking about reducing demand, reducing energy demand by making society.
Yeah, and our society, at our society level, we have to find a way to actually do less things that are actually, we just have to do it differently. Our footprint has to be smaller. And whether we like it or not, that's what we're going to do. And so we have to change our relationship with the environment, but we also have to change our relationship with energy and raw materials. And we're going to have to start managing energy and raw materials like we manage our money, like very carefully. At the moment, that doesn't matter. Like at the rubbish we throw away every day. We don't care. I don't care where it goes. That's someone else's problem. We have to also understand that the biodiversity ecological systems that run the planet are valuable. And in a way where it's not about money, it's about our ability for the human species to live long term. We're very short term in our thinking. Cut that forest down, that's fine, it'll grow back later. And then we don't think about the later. And then later someone else comes along and says, cut another forest down, it'll grow back later. But those two people don't talk to each other. So we have to actually sort of mature to the point where a human species has to grow up, and it has to interact with each other and the environment around it in a more systems context where everyone involved is more aware of all issues. And at the moment, we're very isolated from the consequences of our choices. And that is, whether we like it or not, is going to be imposed upon us by virtue of the existing systems are now starting to deteriorate because we have misunderstood what they were.
So regardless of whether that's a climate change net zero type of constraint or whether it's just a general resources constraint, you see a similar...
All of the above. All of the above. That's what I'm saying, is we've got 7 or 8 macro scale problems landing on the table at the same time. There's the phrase, nature finds a way and the nature bats last. Right. So what's actually happened is we've used abundant energy and abundant money and credit to put off facing these problems. Put them off, and those problems get bigger in the background. But money and energy are joined at the hip. At the petrodollar arrangement. Money is also has been managed inappropriately to the point where now it's a fiat currency and we can just make stuff up. And we have been. Now we're getting to the point where that system's breaking down because the energy system that sits under it has become not as abundant. We're moving into an inelastic supply side for fossil fuels. It's getting more expensive and harder to bring the volumes that we want to market. And so in a systems context, energy is breaking down. The money system that's associated with it's not based in reality, so that's breaking down. And they were the buffer that has prevented us from seeing reality. Lift the veil, all of a sudden, now we're seeing biophysical reality. And it's because we've chosen to do things for the last 50 years has created the situation we now face all problems at the same time. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Good movie, by the way.
My next question was going to be what you think will actually happen rather than, what would it take to get there? But your point is really they're not that different because these constraints are going to be imposed on us either way.
Yeah.
My last question to you then is about the nature of trying to fit society into the box of what, say, net zero or a more sustainable system can actually deliver. Do you think people are going to put up with that? Do you think people are going to accept that? Or do you think it's going to take quite severe turmoil, social turmoil, political turmoil, before people accept these constraints that you're laying out?
If it was able to be done through discussion and dialogue, then we would have done this in the 70s when these issues were first talked about, right? But we didn't because, we have all this nice stuff and these nice toys. And so I call this the two minds. For example, when you see environmental activists in Finland preventing a mine from going ahead, it says, no, we don't do mining here. Mining's dirty, it's unclean, it's unsustainable. Right, but those same activists will then go down to the shopping mall and buy a computer and a phone, and they'll drive around in a car. And when they drive around in a car, not all, but some of them will use petrol in the car. Right, and so what we say and what we do are two different things. And another way of saying that, we want to have products that are sustainably sourced, ethically sourced, done properly. But then when we're actually in the shopping centre, when no one's looking and we have to make a choice with our money about which product to buy, the sustainably sourced product will be 3 and 4 times the cost of the one that's done with the dirty and the nasty. And I'll just buy it. And the majority of the population will do that because they are isolated from the consequences of which option to buy. And so when it comes down to, people will not do this willingly. They will not, they would prefer the well-meaning platitudes that make them feel good rather than the complicated reality that might be a little challenging. They say, do we have to face that? Really? Come on, leave me alone. And so to me, it's going to be messy. Some people are going to understand it, but the sequence of events is this. First, we've got to understand the true set of problems. Like, what are the true challenges? The next conversation is, what are our true capabilities in context of those problems? And that is something that we're not prepared for yet. Then the third step is, for the first time, you can actually make a plan. You can actually do something now. And then the last step is we actually go and do it. And all 4 steps have yet to actually happen properly. But all of society will go through a sequence like that. Some people will do it faster than others. And I think it's just going to be a bit of a mess at first. And current leadership will get up and say, we will meet the challenge, we will do stuff. Like Winston Churchill about, on the beaches of Normandy, we will prevail. Yeah, right. So all of that thinking does not recognize the challenge of the problems is how do we maintain a sustainable system? How do we build a sustainable system for so many people? There's 8 billion of us now. It's a different matter if we had a relatively small number of people. Yes, you could adapt. There's more resources available per person. But when we have shortages of all kinds, once the existing system lifts and there's nothing to replace it, we have to seriously innovate and fall upon inner reserves of the individual person. So it's going to be messy. I think these things will be imposed. There's a sequence of events. I think it will start with the economic stuff. And shortly behind the economic stuff, we'll have the energy problems. I thought we would see food shortages in the late 2020s, but it looks like we're going to see them this year as a consequence of the monkey business in Ukraine and other things altogether. And so we've got a whole series of problems which will red pill the population at large, and they will have no choice but to see this. And I think a lot of the information that will be told will be simply not correct because it's based in old thinking. And so people at large will have to, for themselves, understand what they're seeing. And this is where the new social contract comes from. And there's a we ain't standing for this, followed by what's practical.
Those 4 steps correspond quite nicely to your reports that you've got planned and you've already got out. So why don't you tell us about those?
So, okay. There were 6 reports planned to describe the problem. And the first one was the oil report, which actually looks at the oil industry as it is at the moment. And it's basically around the idea of what does oil do for us and what's its actual status. Then there was the, if we were to phase out oil, how big is the challenge? The challenge is much larger, which has industrial implications and time implications. The next report after that was the how much minerals will we need based on that large system. That's now being published now. After that, there was a planned thing that's like, if everything was recycled, how much could we actually expect to get back? And so that's the true relationship between mining and recycling. Both will happen and they may even merge. Then there was the planned work, which may not go ahead now because I don't have time. What does coal, in particular, do for manufacturing? All existing manufacturing is dependent on fossil fuels, coal in particular. To make a solar panel, you've got like a silicon wafer, you've got to heat it up to 2,200 degrees Celsius. Right? At the moment, we use coking coal to do that, and mostly it's done in China. Take away the coal, how do you actually do that? And you can things like biofuel, you've got hydrogen, electric arc, and they're all perfectly fine in small systems. But now we scale it up to deliver the volumes that we need. And that's when the trouble starts. We can't make that much biofuel. We can't make that much hydrogen, and so on. So that was the plan. But what has changed with that plan is last year, everyone who saw my work universally said, fix it, mate. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care what you've got plans. You will now stop that and you will develop a plan B. Get on with it. And I, yes, sir. Some people in the Swedish government actually contacted me and says, all right, you've got some challenging stuff here. What do you suggest? And that work is actually probably more pertinent than actually sort of pointing out what the problem is. So the next generation has come out, and I just did a policy briefing for BSR, the University of Turku. I can give you the link. That actually came out a week ago. But what that did is, in 50 pages, redesign the circular economy in context of a mineral shortage and a fossil fuel shortage, and also change how we grow our food, and how does industry reorganize itself around a new energy system. And so that is now it's supposed to be the starting point of the conversation. Here are some ideas on the table. And so everyone around the table can say, oh, we're not sure we like these ideas, but then they can have a discussion about why they don't like them, and they might be able to find a better combination. And that's the purpose of that report. Now, the third part is when we actually the fourth part is when we go off and actually do something about it. Come on, guys, do something. I do have some things planned in that context. That involves my career after GTK, the Geological Survey. So when that starts up, I will actually stand down from GTK, or I'll go off and do something else, and I'll be an adjunct at GTK or something. But what that is has yet to be actually secured, so I'd rather not talk about that. But there is a step 4 for me. I do have a plan going forward in terms of physical action to put that plan on the ground.
It sounds like quite frankly you're going to have to run for Secretary General of the UN or something on that scale too.
No. The problem is power is very illusionary. People in those positions are beholden to so many interest groups around them that they're very limited in what they can do. And frankly, I don't have the patience for that sort of thing. I'd have to be nice to dead shits. And it's not for me. So also from an energy point of view, what is going to happen if everything has to become simpler, then nation states and the idea of global governance isn't going to work. We have to actually break down to a more localized, decentralized form of government. And when it comes to actually practical stuff to do, right, federal governments don't have anything useful. State governments don't have anything useful, but the city councils and shire councils do. They own the hospitals, they own the waste transfer stations, they own the schools, and all that. So I can see a situation where the authority of who does what and when, but I'm not saying countries like Australia will balkanise. I'm saying that instead of the federal government having the absolute authority over everyone else, that authority will be transferred to the shire councils, right? And the role of federal and state governors will change. They'll become more subservient and they're more assistant-based because the hard work and the hard choices are made in a more local context. And so the social governance of a nation state would change form to reflect the energy reality that sits behind it. I think we can go down that route. And in fact, the World Economic Forum thinks the same way because all their ESG platforms in their Agenda 2030, are to have a direct relationship with all shire councils around the world. Direct relationship with direct information transfer, bypassing federal and state governments. And so even the WEF recognises the energy reality of what we're doing is going to be more decentralised. And it's going to be something like that.
This has been the most extraordinary interview where I've been terrified and optimistic and completely agree and completely disagree all in the one package. I don't think I've ever had it to this extent with someone. Thanks very much for joining us, Simon. And to everyone who watched this, I don't know how you're feeling about it, but I think the key point is that the energy transition is not going to happen as it's currently envisioned because the hard constraints are there on our planet. Thanks for watching.